Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're at joining us today. Welcome. Dinaway Magani Duk, welcome all my relatives. Greetings. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to log on here, as we are just 2 minutes after the hour before we get started. You'll notice that you have a control panel and everyone is in listen only mode except for our panelists here and our moderator. If you have questions, there is a, on your little panel that should be showing up on the right hand side of your screen, there is a drop down where you can send us questions and we will answer those at the end. We are going to issue a couple of polls as well to see who's with us today. So you'll see those pop up on the panel as well. But while people are joining us, I'm just going to go ahead and get us going here. So, miigwech gitimanidu. Thank you, Creator, for this opportunity today to come together to honor the memories and the lives of our ancestors and our relatives who died or went missing at boarding schools. We ask that you would be with us as we share about these stories and events, that you would hold our tears and hold our hearts and bring us the healing that we need. And miigwech. I just also like to say that, because we're going to be covering some content that may be upsetting, to take us through a quick breathing exercise that helps if you're starting to feel a trauma response in your body. So just being aware of what's going on in your body, paying attention to your breath and where you might be holding tension. And the breathing technique that I use is actually been proven scientifically to put your vagus nerve back at rest, which takes you out of the fight or flight. So when you're in a period of where you are facing danger, or if you feel threatened and you go into that trauma response, the fight or flight response, your breathing becomes shallow, and actually you inhale more than you exhale because your body's trying to get extra oxygen so that you can run or whatever. So the trick is to inhale for 4 counts and exhale for 8. So it literally hacks your central nervous system to think that you can relax because you're exhaling longer than you're inhaling. I'm not going to do the breathing exercise right now and make you listen to me breathe, but just remember that you can breathe in for 4 counts and out for 8. Even if you run out of breath, still hold the 8 counts until you breathe back in again. And do that for 4 or 5 times, and that will help put you in a more relaxed state. Also, Sam, can you drop in the link to the trauma resources on our website? If anyone is feeling like they need to talk to someone, there are some resources listed. And obviously, if you're really upset, you can always reach out to us, or you can remove yourself from the webinar and take care of yourself, and hopefully talk to somebody. And we think of caring for people in boarding. When we do the boarding school healing, we think of caring for people on 3 different levels. One is like clinical support, so if you need to talk to an actual counselor or mental health professional. Spiritual support, so talk to the people who are your spiritual advisors, whatever your beliefs or faith may be. And physical, make sure you are drinking water and getting rest and eating good foods for your brain and your body. And emotional support. I guess that's kind of like the physical, but thank you for putting that link in the resources. or the link to that resource in the chat, Sam. I'm going to go ahead and start our poll. So first of all, we would like to know how many boarding school survivors or descendants are with us. So you will see the poll open on your right-hand panel, and please let us know. We appreciate all of you being here. We just want to know who we're talking to today in the audience. And I am a boarding school survivor descendant, even though it won't let me participate in the poll. So it looks like we've got almost everybody has voted thus far, and we have the majority of people are not boarding school survivors or descendants, and that's okay. That's good. We're glad you're here to learn about this history from an Indigenous perspective. And it looks like we have a few boarding school survivors and about 25% boarding school descendants. So thank you for being here. We honor the presence of all of you who've come to join us today. So tell us what your interest in this is. What sector are you joining us from, if this is work related? Otherwise, you can click other, which we're only limited to these responses. We can only put 5 in there. Otherwise, it'd be a longer list. So are you joining us from tribal services or urban Indian services, social work or child welfare or counseling or healing, education, academia, higher ed, or library or information services, sciences, or other? Oh, I didn't launch the poll. There we go. My apologies. I was like, why is no one responding? There you go. Okay, now the poll is open. And if it's other, please go ahead and send us in the chat which sector we weren't able to include in the list. Oh, this is great. This is very, we have a very diverse audience. Looks like we've got about 10% tribal or urban Indian services, 13% social work, child welfare, counseling, or healing. That's great. I'm glad you all are here. 24% education, academia, higher ed, 11% library or information sciences, and 43% other. We always get so many of those others, right? Just because of limitations of the poll here. So tell us where you're joining from. That would be great. Thank you for participating in the poll. And welcome to webinar number 3 in our 2021 webinar series for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And we are, let's see, trying to drive all these things on my laptop here. Our mission is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma that is a result of the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We're based and headquartered out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm coming to you today from a hotel room in Montgomery, Alabama, where I am visiting the Equal Justice Initiative's lynching memorial and lynching museum. So it's a very heavy day for me today with all the conversation and emotions around so many human rights violations and so many injustices and so many lost lives. And so if I get really heavy and cry, just light some smudge for me, please. And I'll probably be smudging. I've got like a few more smudges here. Like I'll be smudging throughout the whole webinar today. But we're glad that everyone has come to join us. And I'm going to turn it over to Sam, who's going to moderate our panel for today.
Tonalde no yulikni shimo sewitsino nanotoka Samuel Torres Mashika. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Sam Torres. I'm the Director of Research and Programs here for NABS, and we're very excited to be able to engage in this dialogue with you and to have these incredible panelists be able to share their stories, their work, and in a really collaborative and evocative way. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to our first panelist, Lauren Peters. Lauren is enrolled with the Ogdagu tribe in the Unangax Nation, the people of the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands of Alaska. She's a shareholder of both Tanagusi Corporation of St. Paul Island and the Aleut Corporation. She's a PhD student at UC Davis in Native American Studies, holds a master's in information science from San Jose State University, and a BA in economics from Mills College. She served 2 years on the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act Review Committee. She lives in Northern California with her husband, 2 sons, cats, dog, and chickens. Thank you, Lauren, for being here with us. And then we'll have Marcia Small. Marcia is a grandmother, mother, auntie, friend, associate, and a knowledge sharer with people from various disciplines. In her academic journey, she navigates the revitalization of multidimensional epistemologies of Indigenous worldviews. In correlation with Indigenous knowledge foundations, Marcia employs Western methods of geophysical systems, specifically ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and a geospatial information system. Within all methods, she applies herself as an Indigenous researcher who is a voice for the children who remain in Indian boarding school cemeteries. As Northern Cheyenne woman, Blue Teepee woman as she is named, embraces the Tsitsistas ways of doing, especially those of respect, reciprocity, and responsibility. She grew up on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation and plans on returning there when her academic journey is over. In 2005, she graduated from Chief Dull Knife College located on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Lame Deer, Montana. In 2009, she received her Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies, Social Policy at Southern Oregon University, located in Ashland, Oregon. In summer of 2015, she graduated with her Master's of Arts in Native American Studies and her college teaching certificate at Montana State University, Bozeman. She recently served as the Mark and Melody Tepola Distinguished Visiting Professor at Willamette University, academic year 2019-2020. She's currently pursuing her doctorate in the Individual Interdisciplinary Program at Montana State University, Bozeman. Her foci are Native American Studies, Earth Sciences, Anthropology, and Community Health Disparities. Thank you, Marcia. Next, we'll hear from Heather Whiteman Runsham. Heather is a citizen of the Absaalooke Nation. She is the director of the Tribal Justice Clinic and a professor of practice at the Rogers School of Law at University of Arizona in Tucson. Heather previously worked as a senior staff attorney at the Native American Rights Fund in Boulder, Colorado, focusing on domestic and international legal advocacy on the rights of Indigenous peoples and protecting water and land resources of Indigenous peoples. Prior to working at NARF, Heather served as joint lead counsel for the Crow Tribe of Montana, where she oversaw a wide variety of legal issues, including the final phase of negotiation and approval of the Crow Tribe's water rights settlement and preliminary implementation of the settlement. Before working with the Crow Tribe, Heather practiced in New Mexico as an assistant public defender and additionally worked in private practice serving tribal governmental clients. Heather received her Juris Doctorate from Harvard Law School. She received her BAFA with high honors in art history and with honors in studio art from the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and her AFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She is admitted to practice before the State Bar of New Mexico and several federal trial and appellate courts. Thank you, Heather, for being with us. And our fourth panelist is Christine Diindiisi McCleave. Christine is the Chief Executive Officer of NABS, an enrolled citizen of Turtle Mountain Ojibwe Nation, and a leader and activist for Indigenous rights advocating for truth, justice, and healing for the genocidal policy of U.S. Indian boarding schools. Diindiisi McCleave was the first employee hired to work at NABS in 2015 and has spent the last several years building capacity, programming, and operations. Diindiisi McCleave has a Master's of Arts in Leadership and a Bachelor of Science in Communication Studies. She conducted her thesis research on the spectrum of spiritual practices between traditional Native American spirituality and Christianity and the legacy of the boarding schools on spiritual activities and Indian activism today. Diindiisi McCleave has dedicated her life and work to pursuing truth and healing for the Indigenous survivors of historical trauma at the hands of colonialism and settler states. She is one of the primary investigators for the Child Removal in Native Communities, an anonymous survey currently being conducted with the University of Minnesota, and has published several scholarly articles, including one titled The Catholic Church and U.S. Indian Boarding Schools, What Colonial Empire Has to Do with God, in the Journal of the West, Catholic Indian Mission Schools, Colonial or Decolonized Spaces in the American West. In 2020, Diindiisi McCleave was instrumental in writing H.R. 8420, Truth and Healing Commission, an Indian Boarding School Policy Act, the first bill ever introduced for a commission addressing boarding school policy in the U.S. She's also a member of the Truth and Reconciliation Working Group for the City of Minneapolis. She is also an Indigenous Studies doctoral student at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. As always, good to work with you, Diindiisi, and thank you for everyone for being here today. Tlasokamati. With that, we'll start with Lauren Peters as our first panelist.
Ayaga Kucha Sakta Cooking. Hello, my name is Lauren Peters. I'm enrolled with the Adagu tribe in the Unangax Nation in the land and waters that are now the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands of Alaska. I'm a first-year PhD student in Native American Studies at UC Davis. I have a designated emphasis in human rights, concentrating on human rights of the dead, and that emphasis is to reflect my work finding and documenting Alaska Native children who died and are burying in Native American boarding school cemeteries. Today I'll talk about the boarding school era, how it affected Alaska Natives, especially orphans, and introduce you to my great aunt Sofia, who's buried at Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, and who are repatriating home to St. Paul Island this summer. So to situate ourselves, this is a map of the territories of Alaska Native cultures, and the area that we're going to be focusing on is the Purple Island region, which stretches from the mainland over to what would be Russia. And just under the bow of the boat is Unalaska Island, where the Jesse Lee home was. And just above the word Unangax are two little purple dots, the islands of St. Paul and St. George. And St. Paul was where my mom was born. And St. Paul is also where Sophia was born. And the other area we're going to look at is the dark green area to the right. And that's where the first boarding schools were established. So the Unangax Pribilofs, the St. George and St. Paul Islands, are the largest fur seal rookery in the world. In the 1700s, the Russians took Unangax away from the Aleutian Island homes and brought them here to club seals for their pelts. And then in 1867, just 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation freed the Southern blacks, the U.S. government bought these two islands full of captive workers, and they were called slaves of the harvest. It was sort of set up like a company town, but the occupants were not U.S. citizens. They were considered wards of the state and would remain that way until 1983. So the men worked harvesting fur seals. The women's jobs were to take care of their sealing husbands. Girls would marry into the sealing industry, and boys grew up to be sealers. Orphan girls were worse than useless. In the late 1880s, a way to offload these orphan girls reared its head in the form of boarding schools. Widows and orphan girls were a drag on the sealing profit. So today I'd like to introduce you to my great aunt Sofia, so share her journey and how her life is affecting so many today. So here I'm introducing you to my two great aunts. They're the cute little bookends. On the left is my Aunt Irene, and on the right is my Aunt Sofia. And the captain in the middle and the back is the first Black Sea captain, Captain Healy. And two of the people standing in the back, a couple, are Mr. and Mrs. Tuck. And this is them stealing these 5 children from St. Paul Island and taking them down to the Methodist home called the Jesse Lee home on Unalaska Island. Irene on the left died there. And then the following year, they took Sofia 4,000 miles away to Carlisle Indian School. So this is Carlisle Indian School, founded by Lieutenant Henry Pratt in 1979 and stayed open until 1918. Their motto was "Kill the Indian and Save the Man." It was modeled after the Freedmen schools, the freed Black men after the Civil War. And it was the first U.S. government-funded school. I'd like to point out these little girls in the front look to be about 4 or 5 years old. And I was thinking they're at a kindergarten, they would be playing patty cake and braiding each other's hair and playing string games. They would not be looking this unhappy. And if you look closely at all these pictures of all these kids, there's not one happy face in the bunch. And I've looked at this picture for a very long time, and I have still not been able to find one happy face. So while Pratt was building his schools on the East Coast, Reverend Sheldon Jackson was moving up the West Coast. And in 1878, he moved uninvited up to Alaska. He built schools on his own and divided Alaska up for the Protestant churches. In 1881, he and John Brady declared 160 acres in Sitka to be theirs, took over a cannery, built a sawmill, and recruited boys to build their own school. Pratt and Jackson had a rich past. Jackson's sister was a wife of the Reverend George Norcross, who was the pastor of Pratt's and Jackson's home church, and all of whom had similar goals for Native people. By the mid-1890s, he'd lobbied Congress to increase his Alaskan budget from $30,000 to $145,000 per year, which is about $4.2 million by today's standards. They were making money with government contracts, using student labor, and some funding from the church. So this is Sofia's student record. The first thing you'll notice is that she is dead. So it reads Sofia Titoff. She's from Alaska and she was Aleut. The first mistake on here was her father was not named Matthew. She went to Carlisle at age 12. She was 4'6" and 80 pounds, which speaks to her malnutrition. And these lists of names in the middle are what is called an outing program. So they were sent out into the all the way to New Jersey and Maryland, Pennsylvania, to work as a domestic servant in these people's houses. And you can see on the bottom right, she came home sick in May of 1905, and she died almost exactly a year later. So there are other mistakes on the records, even though the records are very thorough. For example, the father's name on this card, and when they moved her grave, they, instead of writing Alaskan, they wrote Chukson for the tribe, and they misspelled her name as Tatoff instead of Titoff. So when I first approached St. Paul tribe about repatriating Sofia, they said absolutely not. They didn't believe in repatriating remains. But when I showed them that she had been moved at least once, they started to reconsider. Legally, as her family, we had every right to remove her from the cemetery, but the tribe didn't have to accept her back. So we waited. 3 years I traveled to Alaska and built community, giving them little facts and walking away until they finally came around. So the cemetery on this picture on the left was first located in this area, and then it was moved back to this lower right area. And it was moved in 1927, about 10 years after the Indian school had closed. And you can see it says East North Street, so that's that road right here. And this used to be at the back of the barracks, and then they moved it. So the gate is right here on the other side of the cemetery, and you can see the stoplights there. This is a quite busy road. This is not a peaceful place for our children to be. So in the original cemetery, she was down here in this lower left E7 spot, and then after 1927, she was moved into A16. So I'll tell you a little bit about the process of if you believe perhaps that your child is at Carlisle Indian Cemetery. So this link, carlisleiindian.dixon.edu, is a fabulous resource. There's a lot of different ways to search for your family member. And if you do find your family member, you send a notarized affidavit to the Army Department of Cemeteries. Now that sounds really scary, but there's a form and you just fill in, it's already filled out for you. You just replace the name on the space with the name of your child and then your relationship to her. You take it to a notary who signs, you sign it in front of the notary, they stamp it, which makes it an official document to send to the Department of Cemeteries. Costs about $20. So then the Army will acknowledge that they received it, and then we'll make contact with you probably in February to say that you're on the schedule, which take place in June and July. They refund travel for 2 people, hotel per diem and your plane ticket or your mileage. But you have to pay for that up front, and you have to make the hotel reservation at the hotel of their choice, and you have to submit all the documents, which can be a hardship for some people. They say the remains will be handed minimally with no DNA extraction, but I'm going to trust and verify by having a babysitter for her while they're doing that process. You can have ceremony before the starting period and during the transfer of possession, which happens about 4 days later. And the remains are carried to and from the gravesite in Carlisle to the gravesite wherever he is going by a contracted carrier who is Native, and you're assigned a tribal liaison who's also Native. He picked you up at the airport, clears you through the base, and I kind of call him a kind watchdog. But this is the Army, and so they have no emotional investment. They're very good at what they do in that they are very efficient, but they use Army terminology, which can be a little rough. For example, they gave me the process schedule for the 4 days that I'm going to be there with Sofia, and they titled it the execution schedule. They also printed a press release without sharing it with me, and have said to me that they don't understand why this is such an emotional process for us. So don't expect them to be anything but a very polite machine. So in closing, there were 357 Native American boarding schools, and almost all of them were modeled after the Kill the Indian, Save the Man motto, and almost all of them had their own cemeteries. Article 10 of the 2007 UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples reads, Indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation, and where possible with the option of return. We'll be returning Sofia in June this year. In all this darkness of stolen children, I can't help but marvel in the meaning of her short life and how many people she's touched. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't have enrolled in this PhD program. I would not be talking to you now if she had not experienced the life she had. So many people are seeing this as the end of things being done to Alaska Natives and Unangax specifically. Returning Sofia is creating an excitement on St. Paul Island and is giving hope to young people on the island that we can take back our culture, our language, and our stolen children. My job is to locate the children and connect them with their families, because orphans who die away from home just disappear. Kagalakuk.
Laskamati, Lauren, for sharing your story with us. We would like to now invite Marcia Small, to share with us her story and to be able to tell us about her work. So thank you, Lauren. We will have a Q&A towards the end, so feel free to think about some questions and potential discussion points for the panel towards the end. So with that, Marcia, I will share controls with you. Just go ahead and unmute yourself as well, and I think we'll be ready to go.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Babeshu. No, Dr. Bienava, Nahaishu. na Tsitsistas. My name is Blue Teepee Woman. I'm Northern Cheyenne. My American name is Marcia Small. I'd like to start out with a land acknowledgement and thank those people that were here originally on the lands in which I'm working on for creating this space and holding the spirit of this land. I have a few things I want to say, and then I'll lead into a short PowerPoint. I know I don't have much time, and I get kind of, I can get going on this. So the primary objective of this healing is to locate known and unknown graves of the soul and kidnapped Native children buried in Indian boarding school cemeteries. Most of the children were taken by force from their homes by the United States government, and then who then handed them over to selected religious institutions. Indian boarding school era policies have created a miasma of complex issues in Indian country. During this policy area, thousands of children were taken from everything they had ever known, many of them as young as 2. Across America, there are hundreds of historic Indian boarding school cemeteries and a few working cemeteries with no available records of the children who hold the space in them. Countless children are returned to their homes, and hundreds remain in the Indian boarding school cemeteries. There are literally thousands of children missing, and this has created relationship disconnections, which reverberate through socioeconomic and political foundations in Indian communities across the United States. The reason I know this is not only because of the research I'm doing, but because I get asked at least twice a month. Hi, Marsha. I am this person, or I'm so, you know, I read about your work. Can you help me find my great aunt? Can you help me find my great uncle? My mom or my dad or one of my relatives spoke of them often. It really bothered them, and it bothered them till their death, or it still bothers them to this day. Usually they would always cry. These Indian boarding schools were a genocidal vehicle geared toward erasing everything that was Indian in the child, an out-of-control mechanism that continues to destroy Native lives, the epistemologies, the axiologies, and ontologies, the ways of knowing, the ways of doing, and the ways of being. With the loss of these ancestral holdings, tribal members are experiencing disconnections from their tribal ancestors and from their communities, their lands, and the very language that defines them. Ontology and axiology rest on epistemology. This means that the information we garner, the ways of knowing, our epistemologies are embedded in the truths. As one of my cousins says, our truths have sharp edges. This panel is part of those sharp edges, edges that America does not want to recognize nor be accountable for. Those brutal truths of the Indian boarding schools and how the atrocities committed there are still resonating through Native communities today, both on and off reservations. Working toward healing in Native communities and Indian boarding schools histories depends on accuracy, the brutal truths, those sharp edges. To find that accuracy, those truths, we need access into embargo archives, the hidden archives, the archives held under the Freedom of Information Act. In other words, we need to unlock those gates of secrecy, both in the churches and in the government archives. This is major. To complete a spatial address and an accurate count not only determines the names, the entry, and the possible exit, but it answers the echo of where are the children, in which cemetery. In other words, where's the rest of my family? What did you do with them? In association with archival research and the request for the United States government to accept the responsibility for the missing children, we are doing geophysical surveys in the Indian boarding school cemeteries. Each cemetery is different. The soils are different, the topography is different, multiple factors can have impact on each survey. It's tough work. It's not easy, not just the physical, but it's draining, super draining to work in a cemetery. You must also have expertise to read the data. It's not magic. Reading data requires years of working in the trenches. I am not there yet, but I am on my way, and I have one of the world's best geophys archaeologists guiding me. That's what you do, right? You go for apex because you want to deliver the best you can for the healing, for the nations. And this leads me into a couple slides of where we are working. And if I can, I'll show my screen. I have it up. It's not going there. Sam?
Go ahead and just click the PowerPoint button there at the bottom of your toolbar. Should bring up your slides.
Okay, hold on.
And then click share again, enable sharing. You had it up just to get you going there.
Webcam. That's not it. I apologize.
At the top under sharing, you just select show screen.
Yeah,
Green play button.
there it is.
And then hit the PowerPoint icon at the very bottom on your toolbar. And that should bring it up. Or you could minimize your browser.
Okay, now.
There you go.
Got it. I got all kinds of goodies on here. So, as I said, I'm working at Native boarding school cemeteries. We're unlocking the gates. We're utilizing geophysical surveys to locate the Native children in the historic boarding school cemeteries, 1880 to present. I wanted to show these handcuffs, and I know it's gone across Indian country. People are aware of them, but those people that are not aware of them, I ask you, how you would feel if they used these handcuffs on your children or your relatives. You can tell the size by the person's hands. They're little itty tiny ones. So what is ground penetrating radar? It's amazing, but it's not magic. It's non-invasive, it's non-disturbing, and it can be cost effective in relation to, well, first getting approval to retrieve goods, but digging during a hard survey on the land. It's used in cemeteries worldwide, and it works better in Indonesia with magnetometry. I'm working in 2 different areas, one on reservation, one off reservation. I'm working up in St. Ignatius Mission Indian Boarding School Cemetery, and I'm working down here by Salem, Oregon, and the Chemawa Cemetery. As Lauren stated, there's over 360 offers or Indian boarding schools, mostly day. There's 25 on off reservation Indian boarding schools in the United States. I think there are probably more. So this is one of the first areas we have. It's called Chemawa. It's placed low in light water. This right here is a mail thoroughfare, Interstate 5. And in 2015, when I first did the research on it, there is over 87,000 cars going by here a day. That's not just a hop and skip and jump. And there's a interchange right here, and they wanted to put a clover leaf in there. That was fortunately stopped because it's just too close to the cemetery. And the cemetery are about 25 old growth trees, so that kind of impedes a little bit of the survey. Not the subsurface, but the global positioning system survey, the remote. This is the Chemawa Cemetery. This is one of the nations, or the Celeste Nations cultural workers. His name is Peter Hatch. This is Jared Burris out of Ohio Valley Archaeology. He's got a magnetometer and he walks that. These go in cohesion. This is a 500 sensors and software ground penetrating radar antenna. This is at St. Ignatius. And this is Katie McDonald. This is Jared again, and again the same instrument equipment. In these surveys, we try to, no, we don't try. We ask the community to come and help. We bring people into the community because that's your first and foremost consideration, that people from the community know what we are doing, that they approve, but more than that too, that they can take the information that we garner from these surveys into the community and share it. This is the St. Ignatius Indian Boarding School Cemetery. This is Jared's map. You can tell up here the extent of the September survey. It was kind of dry, which can enhance GPR. Where's my scene? Okay, this here's the area. The pink area is where we finished, and the community was told that there wasn't many people left in there. Then in this here pink part, the pink area, we've located over about 614. This here is the whole cemetery. They wanted to, they would like us to do this here, right here, because they feel that there are still other relatives there. In here, you can kind of, you can kind of see this splotchy, but I'll show you here. But I want you to see here where the original boarding school was. This is where the mission is at now, the church that holds the cemetery. The areas in orange are the areas that have been people have been removed, dug up. You can see the road boundaries. Okay, so these here are all the students in here, or not the students, but all the bodies in here. This was a community cemetery too. If you look closely at this, you'll see the east and west delineation, but you will also see north and south. They buried Christians east to west. Those that did not fit the paradigm or their structure, or were considered heathen, were buried north to south. But you can see the exactness, and in this cemetery is pretty. It was pretty full, and like I said, we only did grid A. We still have grid B to go. Fortunately, we are going to be able to do that this year, I think. So this is my acknowledgements. There's so much more I could share with you. If you have any questions, just chat them out to me, or at the end of this, when the questions and Q&As, I'll be glad to answer them then. But thank you. I hope I didn't go over time too much.
Tlaxcamati, Marsha, thank you very much. Really appreciate hearing your perspectives and this incredible work, blending Western and Indigenous ways of knowing and thinking. Many thanks to you. At this time, I'd like to invite Heather, Whiteman runs him, to share about your work, Heather. And I'm gonna go ahead and offer you those controls. Tlaxcamati, thank you. And I know there's so much to think about, but go ahead and unmute yourself as well. And then we'll be able to hear you. So Heather, if you go to audio, the drop down, you should be able to change your microphone if the one that's currently selected isn't working.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Okay, great. I don't know, it's the same microphone, but I just clicked it again and I guess it's working now?
It works well. Yes, you're good to go. Thank you.
Okay, and can you see my screen?
Everything looks good.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, Diawaga Michik, Balaja, Heather Whiteman Rensham Hook, Ko Bikulak Ashbejecha in Tucson, Arizona. My name is Heather Whiteman Rensham. I am from the Valley of the Chiefs, known today as Lodgegrass, Montana, on the Crow Reservation, and I also live in Tucson, Arizona, where I teach and work during the academic year. I'm really pleased that today I'm presenting from my own tribe's homelands on the Crow Indian Reservation in Ashbejecha, or Valley of the Chiefs as we call it, and want to pay respect and acknowledge the many sacrifices made by my ancestors, as well as the value and care that many other Indigenous peoples felt for the land from which I'm speaking today. So thank you, good afternoon. I'm talking a little bit today about the submission that was made by a coalition of Indigenous organizations and individuals regarding children who were taken either by the United States or agents and entities working on behalf of the United States under the United States boarding school policy, and who were never accounted for, whose fate was never communicated back to their families, to their communities, and whose whereabouts and fate remain unknown to the present day. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we ultimately ended up working together to do through the United Nations system, and a little bit about the results of that so far and some potential pathways forward, and a little bit of background about the UN body that we chose to make our submission to. So in this cover slide, I have a picture of a group of us who were part of that filing. And as you can see in this picture, and you'll recognize Christine and Marsha and myself, as well as Eleanor Hayden, who was one of the individual submittees on the petition. And we're smiling in this picture. This is shortly after we had presented to the UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances. And not too long before this picture was taken, we were all, of course, in tears because of the emotion and the heaviness and the weight of the issues that we were talking about. And you know, each of us are survivors of, or descendants of boarding school survivors, so in many ways survivors ourselves as well. And so I think what you see reflected in this picture is hope and a feeling that we were in a process finally that will help us find some support and pathways forward towards healing for our communities. So by way of background, I wanted to just go through a few of the steps forward. The Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which I'm sure Christine can talk a lot more about, was founded earlier in the mid-2000s, 2000-aughts by the Native American Rights Fund and a group of interested Indigenous individuals and entities who felt that the time was right to focus on ways in which to address the ongoing impacts and legacy of the boarding school policy in the United States. One of the first initiatives begun towards that was spurred by the recognition that with incomplete information and incomplete history, and not even being able to really state what the scope, the full impact, the numbers behind the boarding school policy in the United States, not knowing those, not being able to speak with any degree of certainty about, you know, what the sheer scope of the policy was, we needed more information. And so in 2016, a Freedom of Information Act request was made to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education. We received an informal response from the federal government, never received any formal response, nothing in writing. But basically what was communicated back to the coalition and to NARF at the time was that the request was too broad, that there were just too many records that were potentially relevant to the request. They were located in many different locations, and that the federal government is not in the business of doing research for outside entities and groups or individuals. But that was all communicated informally through telephone conversations and perhaps emails. In 2017, the Bureau of Indian Affairs related to a reporter who had called to make inquiries relevant to the request, the FOIA request, after talking with NABS and others about this particular ongoing question and ongoing project. The BIA informed this reporter from an outside media entity that our request had been closed. The reporter relayed that information back to our group, and it was news to us that the request had been closed. So knowing that the federal government was obviously not following protocol or its own regulations and rules and processes, we decided that we needed to elevate our request and bring additional outside attention to these issues and our lack of follow-up and the lack of accountability that continued from the federal government here in the United States. So we also at the time were working and talking and reviewing some of the results and the steps that had been taken in Canada regarding residential schools. And these conversations led us to look towards the UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances as a potential UN body that might be helpful and would certainly be very likely to take an interest in this issue because of the mandate of that body, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, and because of the nature of the issue here, an ongoing absence and unaccounted for taking of individuals from their homes, from their families, from their communities, and that the continued reticence of the United States to provide information that would enable families and tribal nations to find and account for these children was squarely within the mandate of that working group. In May of 2019, we went to Geneva, the four of us who you saw in the picture in the title slide. We went to Geneva, met with the working group, and presented our submission in person to the members of the working group. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. Okay, I'm trying to move this. If I could just move this menu over. Okay, great. So a little bit of background about the UN Working Group. It was established in 1980 by the United Nations Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is a body within the UN system. It sits below the UN General Assembly. So it's a targeted organ of the United Nations that deals with human rights types of concerns and all of those issues. They're based in Geneva, Switzerland. The mandate of the UN Working Group is to accept submissions from individuals and organizations on individual cases, in other words, cases of individuals who have been taken by a state into custody or by agents of or people who are working under the authority of a nation state. They also accept general allegations, and general allegations are submissions that allege a more general policy-based or law-based situation in a given member state that is alleged to violation of rights that the working group is tasked examining and assisting with alleviating violations of. The mandate of the UN Working Group has a very strong focus on the right to truth, as well as the right to information, interrelated rights to be certain, but somewhat distinct. The working group has 5 independent expert members. In other words, these are individuals who work as experts who are not directly affiliated with any government, any state government, and are not UN employees, or they come from outside of these systems. The 5 members of the mandate and are chosen by and affirmed by the UN Human Rights Council. The most recent, or the fairly recent outgoing chair, I think he might not any longer be the most recent, but 2 chairs ago, Bernard Duhaime from Canada was the chair at the time that we made our submission, and he was extremely familiar with the history that we were discussing here, being from Canada and having very recently been a participant in some of the processes in Canada towards truth and reconciliation regarding residential school policies. The UN Working Group holds 3 annual meetings and reports on their activities and submissions, and makes submissions and reports to the Human Rights Council each year that give in detail the submissions that have been received, and also indicate whether any response has been received from the member state at issue. So a couple of things that I think are helpful just as far as the sort of standards, the declarations, the law, basically the principles of international law that guide the activities of the UN Working Group. First of all, there's the UN Declaration on the Rights of All Persons to be free from enforced and involuntary disappearances, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in February of 1993, which states that enforced disappearances, and provides sort of as in something like a definition of what is an enforced disappearance. Well, this states that enforced disappearances occur when persons are arrested, detained, or abducted against their will, otherwise deprived of liberty by officials of different branches or levels of government, or by organized groups or private individuals acting on behalf of, with support, either direct or indirect, or with consent or acquiescence of a government. And that then is followed by refusal to disclose fate or whereabouts of the people concerned, and refusing to acknowledge the deprivation of liberty of those people, which places them outside the protection of law. So when we think about how that definition and the different factors and criteria that are in that definition, it's clear that the taking of children from Indigenous communities in the United States and keeping them against their will and against their family's will in most cases in the boarding schools meets that definition, and the ongoing refusal of the United States to provide accountability or information that will assist families and tribal communities with locating and determining the fate and location of those individuals further falls within this definition. Next, we had the International Convention. So this declaration, we often talk about declarations on Indigenous rights, and this particular declaration developed into an international convention. The International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance was adopted by the General Assembly in December of 2006. Several years later, in December of 2010, it became a convention that was in force. To date, at least 96 states have signed the convention. In other words, acquiescing to the terms of the convention is something that has to be affirmatively done under the processes mandated and required under any individual member states, governmental system and laws. 96 states have signed the convention, 57 states have ratified or acceded to it. The United States to date has done neither of those things. There's also, I think it's important to note, a strong movement for universal ratification of this particular convention. So I think that, it's a convention that seems like it should be difficult for most nation states to deny the rightfulness and the protections provided in it. However, there are certainly a number of member states who are reluctant to do so, including the United States. Of course, the United States is not known for joining and ratifying many international conventions in the international system. Only a few are binding on the United States, and this unfortunately is not one of them. The UN Working Group has issued a number of comments and reports that I think are really helpful and, again, underscore the facts of our submission, and that, you know, this particular circumstance, while these disappearances are comparably fairly far back in time compared to many of the cases that are brought to the UN Working Group, it is clear that this is a situation which, because of the nature of a disappearance, the ongoing nature of a disappearance, falls within the mandate, falls within the authority of this working group to assist us in addressing the lapses and the problems and the ongoing wrongs that we are facing here regarding the boarding school policy. So the working group had issued a comment on the right to truth, which really gets to the heart of what we need to see happen here. And this is just an excerpt from operative paragraph 1 of the comment on the right to truth. The right to the truth in relation to enforced disappearances means the right to know about progress and results of an investigation, the fate or the whereabouts of the persons, and the circumstances of the disappearance, and the identity of the perpetrators. Another comment that is particularly helpful is the ongoing nature of disappearances, and this again deals with how can we bring disappearances that occurred in the early 20th or back in the late 19th century before a body that wasn't established until 1980. Well, again, the ongoing nature of disappearances, enforced disappearances, are prototypical continuous acts. The act begins at the time of the abduction and extends for the whole period of time that the crime is not complete. That is to say, until the state acknowledges the detention or releases information pertaining to the fate or whereabouts of the individual. We are still waiting for the release of the information that we need regarding the whereabouts of an unknown number of Native American children. So our submission was jointly made by the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, International Indian Treaty Council, National Indian Child Welfare Association, the Native American Rights Fund, the Saginaw Chippewa Tribe, the Rosebud Sioux Tribe, and several individuals. We included in the submission a list of over a dozen children whose fate could not be ascertained by a review of the records in the archives from just 3 of the many boarding schools that we know of. Marcia Small's work, which you just heard about, really underscored the potential and the potentially substantial nature of the issue that we were bringing before the working group. Eleanor Hayden, who was part of the submission, her aunt, Mary Kanunuk, had attended Carlisle and was never returned home, and the family was never given information on Mary's fate or where she was buried. Eleanor was the individual participant with a family member on our submission. So I wanted to just go over really quickly some of the response to our presentation. The working group was supportive and indicated that they understood the issues we raised and their relevance to the mandate of the working group. They considered our submission not, however, as an individual case, but rather as a general allegation. We did have, of course, one individual case included, again, and also alluded to at least a dozen other individuals who were part of the group of children we were able to identify through archival research that remained unaccounted for. But the working group, most likely because of the substantial number of potential cases, of many unidentified individuals, as well as the age of the cases, looked instead at this as a general allegation. They did encourage us to potentially submit addenda to our submission in the future as we came across additional individual cases that could fall within the purview of our submission. They included our submission in a post-sessional document and recited many of the key elements made in the submission about the boarding school policy, about the particulars of how the United States operated the boarding schools, and what types of things happened in the boarding schools to children, and how this resulted in the failure to account for all of the children that were taken by the United States. The submission was also included in the working group submission to the UN Human Rights Council in August of 2019, which was adopted by the Human Rights Council in September of 2019. And to date, there's no indication that the United States has responded to any of these allegations. A week after the Human Rights Council adopted the advance report by the working group, the Bureau of Indian Affairs corresponded to NARF regarding the FOIA request and basically just said, hey, we never got back to you on this. We have this whole new FOIA process and we may not have responded to you guys. So let us know if you're still interested in pursuing this request within X number of days. I can't remember off the top of my head. However, we did respond to that letter from the Bureau of Indian Affairs that we were indeed still interested in the FOIA request that we had made and the information that was sought through the request. We haven't heard anything additionally in response to our response so far from the United States. This was shortly before the COVID crisis ensued, so I think it's very likely partly attributable to some of the hardships and contingencies that many people, workers at all levels, even in the federal government, were facing during that time. So with things opening up a little bit more with the new administration in place, I think, you know, we will reopen those channels again and give the United States more opportunities to engage, and hopefully we will be able to continue to work with the working group on seeing a response and beginning to make some headway in bringing the United States to accountability and to begin to receive the information that we seek that ultimately will be integral to moving forward and working on healing and working on the initiatives that our communities have been waiting far too long to take part in. And this is just a little bit about some of the follow-up that we did shortly after we made our filing. We also visited the session of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Geneva in July of 2019 and sponsored a side event in which we looked at the issue of boarding schools and Indigenous children and had contributions and perspective shared from Canada and Australia also on their history and their processes and their struggles with those countries in finding paths towards healing and accountability and reconciliation. So I just wanted to say in closing, thank you for listening. And if you are able to provide us with any additional information that might be helpful to our submission going forward, or if you have a relative who remains unaccounted for and you're interested in hearing more about our submission and what it would involve to participate in the submission, I'm really happy to talk more with you individually or in any capacity that works for you. I have my email here, I have my phone number, so feel free to contact us if you have any interest in following up and having a more detailed conversation about these issues. Thank you.
Tlaskamati Heather, thank you so much for sharing all of that. We are now happy to introduce Christine Diindiisi McCleave to discuss, to continue the conversation and to bring all of these concepts together and to describe a little bit about where we're going from here. So thank you, Christine.
Thanks, Sam. And now I am trying to share my screen. So many technical difficulties today. I don't see the button. There we go. Thanks, Sam.
You're very welcome. We got this.
All right. So, are you guys, you see it now?
Yes, it looks good.
Oh, thank you. Well, we need that verbal confirmation. It's so hard to do these webinars when we can't see the people and you're just, it feels like you're talking to yourself. And so you're like, can you see my screen? Can you hear me? But this is the world we live in nowadays. So thank you so much to Lauren and Marsha and Heather for sharing your work with us and your stories. And you know, it's Heather and Marsha, it was just 2 years ago last week that we were in Geneva testifying before the UN on all the children who went missing. And for my last part of this panel, I'm just going to try and tie it all together for us. So, you know, when we talk about this history, we talk about it in terms of the historical context of this entire continent, Turtle Island, as many indigenous people refer to it, was inhabited by indigenous folks since time immemorial. And then, you know, that dude Columbus got lost and was discovered by indigenous peoples, and then a whole bunch more settlers started to come to Turtle Island, and the doctrine of discovery was signed into effect by the Roman Church, saying any lands that weren't inhabited by indigenous or weren't inhabited by Christian people could be taken for the crown and the church, and this gave way to the idea of manifest destiny. And basically, you know, all the rest of the history that indigenous peoples have endured in this settler colonial state called the United States of America have been aimed at the removal of our people from our homelands to make way for westward expansion of this country. All the federal policies were also aimed at that. You can see here from this timeline that we put together that, you know, it was all aimed at removal of these tribal nations and acquisition of land by the United States and civilizing us. So, you know, various policies at different times to basically colonize the indigenous peoples. And the boarding school policy was the major effort at colonization of indigenous peoples. And we've heard, you know, a little bit from our panelists already on that history, right? So Pratt changing the narrative from, you know, the only good Indian is a dead one to kill the Indian in him and save the man. He thought that was the good Christian thing to do. He wrote a book called The Red Man's Moses. Now we know, you know, that was not okay. In fact, it actually meets the definition of genocide according to the United Nations Geneva Convention. And it has created this ongoing systematic racist policy in this country to remove our children. Indian children are targeted for removal because that was the policy that the government set into place. That was the United States' first Indian child welfare policy, right? So our children are still being removed despite the Indian Child Welfare Act. Where there is historical trauma because of this history, and it's passed down through DNA, through blood memory. Adverse childhood experiences, we now know, interrupt the child's developing brain and set them up for adverse health outcomes as an adult, like mental health illness, chemical dependency and addiction, even things like diabetes, heart disease, and obesity, and early death are all linked back to childhood trauma and adverse childhood experiences. So, and then it gets passed down in our families through behaviors. So there's many, many ways that this complex trauma is manifesting itself. Historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, post-traumatic stress, all of that is called complex trauma when you put it all together, right? But we do have hope. We are the most resilient people on the planet. They tried to genocide us and we're still here. And if we have that intergenerational trauma, then we also have our intergenerational wisdom, and we carry that with us. And Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who coined the term historical trauma, also talks about the process of healing. And number one is to confront the historical trauma. Number two is to understand it. 3, release that pain. And 4, transcend it. So where are we at in the United States on this 4-step process? Well, that was a trick question, rhetorical, totally, because we obviously haven't even confronted the trauma. We haven't confronted this history on a large scale, not just boarding schools, but treatment of indigenous people, genocide of indigenous people overall, and treatment of African Americans who were brought over as slaves. And then, you know, every other ethnic minority from there on out, you know, all the BIPOC folks. This is a moment in time where these conversations are coming to the forefront. And, you know, when we talk about the boarding school history and trying to confront and understand that history, we just don't have the answers. As Heather told the story, you know, we did the FOIA request, and one of the interesting things is that as the coalition was formed as a 501c3 nonprofit with the help of NARF, there was the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission going on at the time. And that was the result of a class action lawsuit. And the Canadian government settled that lawsuit and formed the commission. And under the commission, they court ordered all the records to be brought forth. Okay, so we were started by NARF, right? So NARF looked into it, and there's no path forward with a class action lawsuit. It just doesn't work the same in this country. So we're going to have to take a different route to get a commission. And in terms of, you know, having that support to know where the records are too. So where are the records? Well, according to our FOIA request and their unofficial response, and what they said to that reporter, which is how I found out that they had closed our FOIA request. You know, they don't do research, right? And so we did the filing to the United Nations. We've been doing the research on our own, okay? So years of research, many researchers and volunteers over the years have helped us compile this list of 367 boarding schools in the United States. Canada had 150 schools. And from their commission, they know that 100,000 children went to those schools and 3,000 of them died or went missing. So what are the numbers here in the United States? Well, we found 367 schools, but we don't know. We don't know how many children went, what tribal nations those children came from, how many died or went missing, right? So the United Nations Human Rights Council talks about the right to truth. When there are human rights violations that take place, the victims have a right to the truth about those harms. So we have a right to the truth. We have a right to know, not just we deserve to know. We have a right. Okay, so we're looking for the records on our own because the government is not helping us. And we've only found 38% of the records thus far, most of them in federal archives. Okay, so the rest will be in church archives, university archives, private collections and whatnot. We're still on the search for those records. So if you know of a collection that isn't at the federal archives, please reach out to us. And we're going to digitize these, much like the Carlisle archives that Lauren talked about at Dickinson College. We are working with them. They're one of our partners. And we're going to be doing a national Indian boarding school digital archive rather than like just focusing on one school. We're going to try to find the records for all of them and make those publicly available for the descendants, for the relatives, as well as researchers to compare and analyze, you know, the different experiences at different boarding schools at different times. So we do uphold Indigenous data sovereignty as our methodology for interacting with these records. If you want to know more about that, we've got a webinar all about our digital archives, okay? So here we are, right? We've got a right to the truth, we've filed to the UN, and you know, we still don't have these answers, and we still don't have access to justice. And so right before the pandemic hit in February, I was able to visit with then Congresswoman Deb Haaland and tell her about our work and say that, you know, we need a commission in this country. And also, you know, when a commission is formed, we've been doing the work of a commission. So we'd be happy to, you know, to share what we know and be in support of that commission's role to examine the truth of these boarding school harms. And so she introduced a bill in September of last year, which was interestingly timed. It was right after the president at the time said he was going to sign an executive order to give students a patriotic education, one that doesn't teach lies about the country being plagued with racism. So this was definitely a clapback, right? So unfortunately, the bill wasn't able to go anywhere because of all the political theater and the election that was happening. And now Deb Haaland is at the Department of the Interior, and she still supports this bill. And so we are working with some other legislators to reintroduce that bill this session, and hopefully we can get a commission going. We know there's other work going on in terms of a commission, a TRHT commission, Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, but that one largely focuses on African Americans and reparations for slavery, which is also very important. So what's interesting is when you look at truth and reconciliation commissions around the globe, across the country, they usually only focus on one particular racial group. And so that's fine. You know, the situation and the dynamics and the history and the issues for the communities are going to be different for different cultures and groups, okay? But we called our bill the Truth and Healing Commission, not the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the reason why is this, and I shared this with Deb Hallen's office, and I made it a suggestion, and she took it. So I felt good about that, because I didn't want to make demands, right? So, but I said, you know, I don't think we should call it Truth and Reconciliation. The word reconciliation is very kind of controversial. There's a lot of Native people who don't think that's the right word. When you look at the history of the word, it comes from the Bible and, you know, reconciling yourself with God. And then some people say, well, we were never conciliatory to begin with. When you look at the word and you think about it in terms of like reconciling your bank statements, it's literally just reckoning possibly two different accountings, right? And so finding out where the discrepancy is. I can tell you, but that's why we're here today, right? So the other thing was that in 2019, before the pandemic, a hashtag in Canada started trending and made its way to the US too. Reconciliation is dead. And this is after, in that country, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So 4 years after that commission ended, the hashtag reconciliation is dead started trending. Why? Because the government was allowing for a pipeline to go through unceded territory. And so, you know, the thing about reconciliation is it's supposed to be, you know, peaceful, harmonious relationship, and that can't happen and that can't exist, that can't be if the harms and the violations are still taking place. So the model, the academic model of transitional justice, excuse me, consists of judicial and non-judicial measures implemented in order to redress legacies of human rights abuses, such measures include criminal prosecutions, truth commissions, reparations programs, and various kinds of institutional reforms. Transitional justice refers to the ways countries emerging from periods of conflict and repression address large-scale or systematic human rights violations so numerous and so serious that the normal justice system will not be able to provide an adequate response. And that is my argument today, especially as I just came from the Equal Justice Initiative's lynching museum. And what I saw there, the history that they spell out is very clear that we are dealing with systematic racism and that the justice system was designed to protect white slave owners. And I believe, you know, the justice system was also set up to protect white landowners, right? So we have a justice system that will not be able to provide an adequate response. It is not equal justice for all right now in this country. We know that. We saw that when George Floyd was murdered, and it was, you know, called into question whether or not the police officers would even be arrested. You know, did they have immunity? And then, you know, when recently, when we did get a guilty verdict, that was intense because so many people didn't expect justice to prevail. And that's a sad commentary on justice in our country. So we need something, we need transitional justice. We need something bigger than our current justice system, right? It's going to be a long process. We need not only things at the federal government level, but we need things at a local level, and we need people. We need people to get involved, to advocate, and to have these difficult conversations. What we saw happen in Minneapolis really did spark these movements for allies to start listening, right? For non-Native people and non-BIPOC people to start actually looking at the foundation of this country, which was founded on genocide, stolen land, and stolen labor, right? So the Minnesota Council of Minnesota Council of Churches, not nonprofits, that's another group. The Minnesota Council of Churches has planned to do a truth and reconciliation and reparations process. Full disclosure, I serve on their board of directors, but I support this, obviously. I think that's why they asked me to be on the board. And the city of Minneapolis is doing a truth and reconciliation process, and I am also part of that work group. So I'm hopeful that things can move forward. These are difficult conversations, though, and this is going to be a lot of work. And so, you know, the fact that you're all here listening to us today is really encouraging. The number of people, the number of white people that I saw at the lynching museum was also very encouraging. And I had moments of, you know, crying in there because it's a very powerful exhibit. I would encourage everyone to visit it. They did show images of children being separated from their parents, and it reminded me of boarding school. And there were also moments where I was really angry because it's just so unjust. I mean, that's not even the right word to describe it, but, you know, lots of sadness, lots of grief, and anger. And so what do I do with that? I put it to good use. We're here to make change. We're here to speak the truth loudly and clearly and without wavering. That, you know, when we look at the, let's see, I think I have it in my notes, which I can't see on this view, but when we look at this transitional justice, the important thing is, number one, that truth is told from all perspectives, right? That's the big thing about truth commissions, is the people who have experienced the harm and the violation get to tell their story. They get to say, this is what happened to me and my family, and this is how it affected us. So using their voice to speak the truth, we as boarding school survivors and descendants need to be doing that. And then there is, what is the response of the perpetrators, whether that, end up being some kind of, criminal prosecution or reparations. But the most important thing about transitional justice is the promise not to repeat the harm, right? That is what makes transitional justice, in my opinion, the best model. I think transformative justice is good too, but they're somewhat similar with a little bit of variance. But really, we just want it to stop, right? Stop arresting and killing brown and black people and taking our children. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but a lot of work has been done. And we're inviting you to join us in this movement for truth and healing. I think we've given you quite a few opportunities to reach out if you have specific information about children who went missing at boarding school, or location of records, location of unmarked graves, and of course, all the ways to connect with the coalition as listed here on the screen. So I thank you for your time and for listening to us today. And now I think Sam's going to lead us through some Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Laskamati. And I'd like to invite the other panelists to come back into view. We'll take this time to dialogue on some questions that the audience has posited, some really nice, thoughtful questions. So we will get started with, I think, a natural through line from what you were just sharing, Christine, regarding the various truth commissions that are emerging in recent months and years regarding violence and police brutality, specifically targeted towards BIPOC communities, and the disproportionality there. And I think that there's a really good question that's linked to this. So much of our missing children are no different than the missing children, women, and men that are now part of the missing and murdered Indigenous persons movement and awareness. How can the federal government acknowledge one but not the other? This is certainly frustrating. Miigwech, for sharing your knowledge and continuous work on this matter. So how can we make that that link when the federal government seeks to acknowledge one, but really struggles to even acknowledge that the other exists? And that's I think an open question to anyone.
I think it speaks to the larger issue about this country not yet, on the whole, confronting its history and its origins, right? So I think if we were able to have that conversation about the first part of the history, then it would provide the context for what's happening today. It's obviously connected when you come from that place, but I think there's so many people in this country who don't know the history that they're not aware of the connections.
Well,
I
and
know-
I just add to that that I think, oh, go ahead, Lauren.
Go ahead, Heather.
I just add that I think the immediacy of the MMIWP, et cetera, I'm not even sure of which acronym to use to describe that movement most accurately, but there's been such an incredible outpouring of awareness raising activities and a priority put on those issues by leadership in tribal nations, as well as grassroots organizers and the families who are there to keep visibility and attention on those individuals. In this context, I think a lot of the children who went missing, at that point in time, a lot of our communities were struggling with pandemics within our own communities, and so many people were sick, dying, starving, and suffering in ways that we can't even describe in the words that we have to use in English language. So it's difficult, I think, to talk about these issues as well because of how much pain is associated with that point in time and the many wrongs and harms that occurred. So in some ways, we haven't elevated this issue in the ways that we could as Indigenous communities in the United States. And I think we're beginning to do that. And I think that there's a lot of momentum behind addressing these issues and all of the issues associated with the boarding school policy, but the failure to account for children who were never returned home, who continue to be missing, whose families, in many cases, still don't know where they are or what happened to them. We can elevate this issue to where it can be addressed. And I think, this is the beginning of that process that we're seeing happening right now.
Lauren, did you want to add something to that as well?
Sure, thank you. In the Alaskan community, we're just starting to come together to talk about the MMIP, and I attended a listening session with the state of Alaska and a lot of other different organizations that came and talked to us and listened to us, and they want to start the MMIP database starting when we started with statehood, which wasn't until 1949, and I'm encouraging them to push it way back into the beginning of the U.S. Being part of Alaska, which was 1867, to include our kids that were pushed out then.
Thank you very much. Marsha, it's a good question for you. Would love to hear your take on this, but we have a question that states, can you share, Marsha, your personal experience working at the cemeteries when you feel your proximity to so many of these children that are buried? I can only imagine the power of that location and hearing the U.S. Army saying that they can't understand why this is an emotional journey, Lauren. That's unfathomable. So Marsha, if you could just, share to whatever you feel like you're comfortable with, how does that resonate with you? How do you, stay grounded?
Thank you. Good question. It's, well, before we enter the cemetery, we do our Northern Cheyenne protocols, and other nations that are working with us do their protocols. And so that helps for the entry and the respect of the cemetery, because we record we accord that those protocols, those I don't know, a spiritual alignment. I have a hard time working in cemeteries because I'm tied to them. I'm tied to the people there. One time I can tell you a real short funny story. I was in there and I was doing a survey, and it was the end of the day, and I was feeling okay, and you know, because it's very burdensome. Because those children there are very curious still. And I leaned back against this tree, and I was talking to this little girl there, well, you know, in my mind, you know, and I was telling her, I said, Cora, you're so mischievous. Because I'd set an earring there, and then, you know, a couple of days later I go back, or a day later I go back, and it would be gone. You know, because you find stuff in there that they're very curious. And they said, and people lose stuff in there. This is really expensive little earring, so I set it there on a tree, and I set it there on a tree, and I come back next day, it was off the tree, right on her marker, and I leaned back against the tree, and I said, oh, Cora, you're so mischievous, you're so fun. And as I tried to pull away, I couldn't pull away, right? Because there was a tree had been dripping a bunch of tree sap, and so my hair got all tied up in it. And I could just imagine their laughter. You know? It took forever to extricate myself. How do I handle it? It's hard, and I'm not sure I'm sure that the work that we're doing is powerful. So I'm held by my ancestors. I'm protected by my people, and hopefully all your good energies. Yeah.
Marsha. Thank you for that response. Thank you for sharing that process, for sharing your work with us and your spirit. So we really appreciate that. I think we have time for perhaps one more question. Prior to that question, I'd like to put in the chat a link for an application for membership for the coalition. If you are already a member to the coalition, we thank you for being in community with us. If you are not, we invite you to submit an application to join us in this movement. So go ahead, you can find that in the chat there now. And this last question could definitely open a lot of doors and take us in a lot of different directions, but certainly not, it shouldn't be limited to just a couple of minutes. So in that way, it might be an unfair question to ask this group, but I think it's an important one, and will take us sort of beyond where we are right now. But this question states, what would a full reckoning of historical trauma within the United States look like, feel like, sound like from your perspective? Since that's such an open-ended question, I want to keep it open to anyone. But Christine, what does that look like to you first? And then we can kind of go from there.
I wanted to go last. I was totally like, I'll answer that last so I can listen to everybody else talk. Why don't you repeat the question?
Sure. And this can be answered really in part, or you know, really doesn't need to be. What is a full reckoning? What is a full reckoning of historical trauma? Yes, within the U.S.
Such a big question. Yeah, I mean, this is literally what we were grappling with on the Minneapolis Truth and Reconciliation Work Group, but we were trying to limit it to the city of Minneapolis, right? And they kept reminding us, the facilitators, like, well, remember, you know, what certain things are within the city's jurisdiction to deal with, and other things are not. But the unique thing about the city of Minneapolis TRC work is that it's going to be the first in the country, if it goes through to a commission, that would address two racial groups at the same time. So Indigenous peoples and Black people. So it's that work is huge, and we keep thinking about it in terms of the historical context, right? Which is, for Indigenous peoples, beyond this city that came and established itself and called itself Minneapolis and set these like boundaries, these imaginary lines, right? So and I think because of our unique political status as sovereigns of our tribal nations, it just gets really complicated really quickly. So that's just getting into the weeds a little bit, but zooming out big picture, I think it's kind of what, what I outlined that the coalition is trying to do, that would be some of the work of a commission, which is to detail the history, right? What is the truth in history, the accounting of the harms that were done, and then, oh, here we go. I know the answer to this question. It's Dr. Braveheart's 4 easy steps to healing historical trauma, right? We need to confront it, understand it. And I just think it's so huge, right? That there's a lot to those steps. Confronting the history, acknowledging it, examining the truth in its many aspects is going to take a long, long time. We have, hundreds of years of history in this country that has taken a lot of lives, and I think organizations like NABS, even though I work here, but organizations like NABS and Equal Justice Initiative, who are taking the time to make an accounting, right? So this afternoon I was at the museum this afternoon, I'm going to the memorial, and there are 3,000 names of souls who were lynched, and that's what we need more of. We need to confront it. It's painful, but there's no way we can move forward and change this world if we don't. We will just keep repeating these human rights violations, and I think going into the perspective of examining a painful past, although seems really daunting, I think the purpose is to put us back in touch with our humanity, because there's no way you can go to the museum or the memorial or hear these stories from Lauren and Marsha, and not feel something.
Right. Very good. Thank you. I think you did a really good job of unpacking a very challenging and complex question. Would there be anything else to add to that, Heather, Lauren, or Marsha, particularly in the United Nations context, and what is being asked of the federal government of the United States?
Well, I'll take a stab at adding a little bit. It's hard to add to what Christine just said. I think she gave us a really great and complete expression of many of the goals and the work that the great foundations that have been laying to come to a place of reckoning. And as I think about this question, I struggle with which hat to put on and which hat I should wear when I think about it. Should I talk as a lawyer? Should I talk as an Indigenous woman, feminist, mother, sister, granddaughter, all of those things? So what's the medium between my perspectives is all of those things. I think a reckoning will look different for everyone, and for each different Indigenous community. So looking at what the United States needs to do, I think there needs to be a very deliberate effort to be flexible and to be open to the fact that there's not going to be one easy, simple solution. When the United States has attempted in the past to address wrongs to Indigenous peoples or takings of Indigenous resources, those processes have been problematic in their impact and their execution. They've led to continued litigation and resentment and hardship for many Indigenous communities. So the track record of the United States in reconciling things or addressing past wrongs hasn't been a great one. So I think there's a real need to be aware of that history and to seek very deliberately to identify what went wrong before, what approaches, what philosophies were misplaced, and to take more direction from Indigenous nations and Indigenous individuals about how to go about doing this. The problems with past, quote unquote, solutions to the Indian problem have all been taken from a one-sided place. They were taken from the perspective of white America on how do we fix these things and move on. And when we look at our communities and where we're at, where we've been, it's obvious that very few people have been able to move on in the way that mainstream white America has. And so there needs to be a very different solution, a very different approach, process, and philosophy behind the response to the the United States to these concerns and these issues that they absolutely positively will need to confront and address. But the ways that they've done it in the past were very, very problematic, and the intentions and foundations that they laid to date need to be discarded, and they need to start fresh. Looking for guidance in doing that, I think there are some really great examples that we see from some of the UN processes and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and some of the other human rights instruments that we've mentioned today that can guide the United States. Of course, the United States is not the most receptive to international human rights principles, so that needs to change as well if they want to do this right and correctly, and in a way that will be meaningful and have a real impact going forward.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Anything else to add to that? Yes, please.
First, I'd like to thank you all for your work. It's just really amazing. I'm so proud to be a part of this. The thing that I want to see is good faith participation with the U.S. government in releasing records and doing things like we're doing at Carlisle, which is taking back our children. And I want to see the 367 different boarding schools, almost all of them with their own cemeteries. Our children are buried. You know, thousands of our children are buried, and their last thought before they died was, "I want to go home." And I think that that's our responsibility of having this knowledge. Is trying to bring our children home, and yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Lauren.
If I could just add something. So, yes, thanks everyone for being here. It's truly an honor to be part of this. And the primary is for the United States government to accept the responsibility to open the archives, to find our children, to find our relatives, to find our families, but two, to create funding for programs in our tribal communities that address the trauma, the epigenetic stressors. It can't just be a quick Band-Aid. Each nation is different. Each tribe is different. And yes, ultimately to bring our children all home, right? But there are some tribes that don't believe in disinterring their children in these cemeteries. And children could be buried right next to each other from one tribe that says, yes, we want to bring our tribal member home. And the other tribal nation will say, well, no, I don't want them disturbed. So there are a lot of boundaries. There's a lot of mountains to climb here. But primary is that the United States of America accepts the atrocities that were committed upon our children, and to deliver funding to help heal the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you to everyone else on the panel, Heather, Lauren, Christine. Very grateful for this entire session. Very grateful to all of you that have joined us today. Just wanted to inform everyone on the call that we have another webinar next month, June 16th, starting at 6 p.m. This one, hopefully, if the midday scheduling doesn't work for some folks, that this one will. We will have Dr. Michael Yellowbird discussing healing through Indigenous mindfulness and neurodecolonization as a part of striking a balance within this webinar series. Some of the concepts that we're talking about can be very highly conceptual. Some of it is in healing, some of it in the mind, the body, the spirit. So we're really trying to create a sense of balance with our webinar programming this year. And we hope to see you again next month for that. Thank you again to our panelists. Very grateful for you. Please reach out to us with further questions, submit application for membership, and we look forward to connecting with you and continuing to build this movement together. So thank you very much, and we'll see you all soon. Timotaske.